Welcome to this episode of Unraveling Adoption, a safe space to delve into adoption's complexities together. I'm Beth Tyson, an adoptive mom of a 19-year-old son, Joey, who is struggling to find his path. I'm walking beside him while working on my own personal growth and healing. We are committed to helping anyone touched by adoption, and we want to help the general public understand adoption's complexities better too. Today's guest is Beth Tyson, a childhood trauma consultant, trainer, best-selling author, and public speaker. She used to have a psychotherapy practice where she worked with individual clients, but she's now working on a more systemic level, educating organizations and institutions, such as courts and hospitals, about the impact of trauma. She hopes to reduce the amount of trauma that children experience by changing the conditions upstream. Most of her work deals within the foster and adoption systems, and she has a real heart for supporting kinship families. In addition to her advocacy work, she co-created an animated short video series called Connections Matter Academy. Plus, she wrote an award-winning children's picture book called A Grand Family for Sullivan. So welcome to Unraveling Adoption, Beth. I'm happy to have you on to share your wisdom and expertise with us.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I hope I live up to all those wonderful things you just said about me. Thank you so much for having me here today.
Yeah, and this is our first double Beth episode, by the way. So
nice.
There's not that many Beths in the world, so it's fun when you run across another one.
That's true. I'm always surprised.
Are you Beth or Elizabeth?
It's Beth, just Beth.
Me too. Well, usually my guests, since I've changed to Unraveling Adoption as our podcast title, usually my guests are members of the adoption constellation, but I also like to bring in adoption professionals who provide services to adoptees to help them heal. So what about your background would you like to share about your personal background or your education or whatever? And how do you interact with adoptees and foster youth professionally now?
Sure. I think I'll share how I got into this area. I'm not an adoptee myself, and I don't have an adopted family or any children that are adopted. But when I earned my master's degree in clinical counseling, one of the first job opportunities that I came across from a classmate of mine was working with children in home who were about to be removed from their foster home or adoptive home or kinship home due to behavioral issues and challenges that the family was facing. Back then, this was in 2013, many people were not aware of trauma at all. We've come a long way in the last decade. And so it was my role to help to stabilize the family and to help the parents understand trauma. Mm-hmm. So way back in 2013, I was doing a lot of parent education and helping the caregivers understand that the behaviors were not because of them not liking you or not wanting to cooperate with you or being manipulative or intentionally hurtful, but that the behaviors are really stemming from the tremendous amount of trauma and loss that they had experienced from being removed from their biological families. And so that experience opened my eyes to a whole other world I didn't even know existed at that time. Mm-hmm. But I had recently lost my mother suddenly in my 20s, and that experience really helped me want to find purpose and meaning in my life in the work that I do. It made me realize how short life can really be, and that if there's something, a change or a difference you want to see in the world, that it's the time is now to get out there and make those changes for yourself and for others. And that was what motivated me to want to work with families. And also because of that experience with my mom passing away so young, I could really relate, even though it was different than being adopted or being in foster care. It was a different type of loss, but I still knew a different thread of loss there that I could relate to losing a mother.
Yeah. And
that my own grief experience could be sort of a common ground for me and the children and the families I was working with.
Yeah. Yeah. I bet that gave you a lot of empathy, and you were probably working while trying to deal with all that grief, and you could relate to the children who are trying to go to school and function while grieving the loss of their mother in a different manner. Right. But still, it's a loss, a very big loss. Right. A lot of people, when they think of adoption, they don't think loss, they think gain. They think, oh, look, you gained a beautiful new family, and the parents gained a child, and isn't this great? And I think our culture, it's one of the things I'm trying to address in this podcast. The unraveling piece of it is it's a lot of loss. It's mostly loss, I would say.
Yes.
Mostly loss for all involved, honestly,
Mm-hmm.
mostly for the adoptee. So would you like to talk about what you've learned from your clients and being around adoptees and foster youth in your career?
Yes, absolutely. First, I agree with you wholeheartedly on what you just said, that we often do look at the gains. It's one of the few areas in life that we focus on the positives, right?
Right.
Like humans tend to notice the negatives, but for some reason in this area, we do seem to focus on the positive. I think out of a deep desire to want to help because of love and because of wanting to see the positive in a negative situation. There's a lot of motivation there for that. And so I think it comes from a place of good-heartedness and positive intentions. But at the same time, when we gloss over the tremendous, incredible loss that everyone is feeling, there's like this elephant in the room that nobody's talking about, no one's addressing. And yet we're confused about where all the behaviors are coming from. You know, it's like, how do you stay calm in your body when you've lost your mother?
Yeah.
I mean, how do you stay calm in your body when you don't know when you're going to see your biological family again? How do you listen and take directions when you're wondering about the sibling that you've been separated from, or why your eyes are blue when everybody else's are brown? You know, there's just these little things about your own self-identity that get lost in the process of adoption and foster care and kinship families that we don't talk about and that doesn't get acknowledged. And so one of my main goals in the work that I do is trying to raise awareness, like you are, about the impact of grief and loss. And there's actually a specific type of grief or loss that children in foster care and adoptive families are coping with, and it's called ambiguous loss. And ambiguous loss is when there's two types, but the first type is when the person is not physically in your life, but is mentally and emotionally present. And the other type is when the person is physically in your life, but they are mentally or emotionally absent.
It's unavailable.
Right, unavailable. So these are like addiction, like I know you're familiar with, where your son is in your life.
Yes. Yeah, but he's like, I know he's in there somewhere, but he's not on a day-to-day basis being able to be present. And some mental illnesses will cause that too, right? Where you just, the person's just not able to function in a connected way.
Yeah, exactly.
Addiction and mental health can cause that. And then also, if you're separated from your parents or your birth family, they're still alive, but you never get to see them or talk about them or anything like that. So that's ambiguous loss.
Yes, you got it. You nailed it. So there's this constant feeling, it's unsettled, right? It's a loss that doesn't have any boundaries or settling or rituals around it or any acknowledgement of it. And so you're left with this emptiness of grief that no one else can really feel or put words to, including yourself. A lot of times, if you don't know about this concept, then you don't even realize. And so I encourage your listeners to do a little research on ambiguous loss that will really help you address what's going on with your children, because, knowing that someone's out there who has a lot of the answers to the questions you might have is a place of confusion, uncertainty, sadness, anger, maybe resentment, can cause irritability. And, it's just very hard to function in your life when you have all these big questions unanswered.
Yeah. Does grief cause the fight or flight to click in?
Yes. So what a lot of people don't think about, and they think about a grief, usually you think sadness, right? Or maybe anger. You'll hear a few people mention anger. However, what's often missed is the tremendous amount of anxiety that it brings up. And that was my experience. So when my mom died suddenly, it becomes sort of a mixture of both. Of course, there was profound sadness and grief for losing her, but the anxiety I had was through the roof. And so that's that fight, flight, freeze reaction. And the reason for that is because your whole existence gets called into question when you lose someone close to you.
And your mother died without warning. She didn't have a disease or anything that you knew of.
Yeah. She died in her sleep one night suddenly.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So that calls your existence into question. And so that existential fear of Might this happen to me? Might this happen to my other loved ones? It becomes very real.
Yeah. Who's the next one that's going to
Yeah.
disappear, right? Like, oh God.
Right. Which is similar to have children who are adopted or in kinship families feel, it's like when, okay, I've lost my mom. Maybe I've lost my dad too, who's next? And they live in a place of deep fear of losing someone again.
Yes, I can attest to that. My son just cannot settle in. He's never just been able to settle in anywhere. He's got a super huge flight response. That's how he usually deals with stuff. He just like disappears. He literally runs away, or he uses substances to numb out, or he just sleeps a lot and he just checks out. And I cannot blame him now that I understand what's going on, because the very first thing he knew in utero probably was, I'm not welcome here. I'm not wanted. So imagine that being your very first script that you get in your life. Holy cow. So I understand it. I still don't know exactly what to do about it. I don't know if there's a lot I can do. It's probably part of his healing journey, but I have a lot of empathy and understanding that, well, of course he'd want to use drugs once they became super easily available in high school, junior high and high school. Of course, he found something that will take it away. Why wouldn't he? I mean, I think I would, honestly.
Yeah.
It gives you a lot more understanding. It doesn't make it feel any better really, but it goes, oh, of course they would do that.
Right.
And then how, what kind of attitude can I have toward him so he feels supported and not stigmatized? Because a lot of these behaviors around grief and loss and our adopted kids and our foster kids, the behaviors can look pretty bad, quote unquote, according to what society thinks is good or bad. What kind of behaviors do you see in your practice?
Well, the trauma lives in our body, right? It's not just in our head. It can't be rationalized with. And that's why oftentimes talk therapy doesn't really work or isn't very effective. The trauma is in our nervous system, which includes our entire body, not just our brains. And so what I see is a lot of nervous system overload, children who cannot calm themselves down, children who are very fearful and afraid, and they're in that fight or flight response, children with a lot of somatic complaints, which are things like stomach aches, headaches, body aches, because they don't know how to say, I'm really sad, I'm missing my mom or my dad, or I never, even though I never knew them or met them, I'm longing for them. That's an instinctual thing to experience. And yet I can't say this because I might get abandoned again by the people who are caring for me.
Yeah.
So there's this sense of feeling trapped in their body, stuck in their body, uncertain which direction to go. And when you're under that kind of pressure, then you see typically one of two behaviors, like you said, or one of three, really. Like you said, your son tends to run physically. And so we see that, like children that are eloping from the classroom, eloping from the school or the building, actual people running away from wherever they are, using drugs to numb themselves. That's a way of running away from, reality. And then you also see children who will fight. So that's one of the other trauma responses. So aggressive behavior, being angry all the time, acting out, pushing people away, throwing things, breaking things, destroying relationships, yelling, screaming, and all of those types of behaviors. That's the fight response. And then you see the freeze. If neither fight nor flight sort of relieves the anxiety and the panic and the pain that they're in, they will shift into that freeze state where they may be dissociating, losing track of time. These are children who look very forgetful or inattentive, but really their brains have just kind of shut off and disconnected from the prefrontal cortex into a place of safety. And so they are no longer taking in what's happening in front of them. And so you'll see them lose big chunks of time. They won't remember having done something, having said something. They might look very forgetful or irresponsible. And then, of course, they get blamed for those behaviors, right?
Yeah.
Or labeled with ADHD.
I understand that a very large percentage of adoptees are diagnosed with ADHD. That is really common.
Yes, very common.
If we could look at ADHD and those behaviors as perfectly reasonable trauma responses and not some sort of disease, I think that would be better. Yeah.
100%.
I mean, the labels sometimes help. It gets you services or whatever. But I think that these labels, it's better just to say, yeah, my son is acting out because it's a completely normal trauma response.
Correct.
It's absolutely understandable and unfortunate. And he's not broken, or it's quite the opposite. He's so not broken that he created a system to help himself to survive his world.
Exactly.
You got to hand it to him,
Exactly.
He's figured it out, a way to function. It's not ideal. It's not healthy, but he was and is really, he's 19, but he's a kid. He's just trying to make do with what he has in his power and his control.
Exactly.
So if we can look at our kids that way, that shifts it a bit, then thinking, my kid is bad, my kid is naughty, my kid has got some sort of disorder, my kid needs to go to the doctor and blah, 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 dragging him here and there. If we can think of it, especially as adoptive parents, think of it as, of course they're going to be feeling that way. And of course they're going to find a way to relieve that pain.
Yeah.
Okay. So say we figure that part out. What are we supposed to do now?
Yeah. So I just want to echo what you're saying and give you guys a little bit of hope. I recently spoke with a woman who's getting her doctorate degree, and she needed to speak with an expert to discuss trauma and ADHD. And she's writing her dissertation on the misdiagnosis of ADHD and children with trauma.
Oh, wow.
And so she's using assessments. What she's finding in her research is that the more we use the trauma assessments, the less we're identifying people with ADHD.
Oh.
And that's, a real shift that needs to happen in our society, is that, we tend to gravitate toward ADHD for a couple of reasons. One, it's very disruptive, right? It's very disruptive in our systems, in our classrooms, in our communities. So we need a solution.
Yeah.
And ADHD has a pill.
Oh, right.
Has a pill to solve all the problems, right?
It's amphetamines, right?
So, right. So it becomes more attractive because of that. And again, not probably out of bad intentions, but it's like, oh, we want to, as humans, we want to solve problems, or like we see a problem, let's solve it. Oh, there's a medication for this. Okay, let's fix the problem. But we're not looking at the whole person when we're doing that. And we're not looking at their life experiences. And oftentimes as caregivers, we might not classify something that's traumatic that was traumatic to a child.
Mm-hmm. Can everyone decide what's traumatic for themselves? Like what might be traumatic for me is not traumatic to someone else. Is that true?
Yeah, that's true. That's very true. It's subjective. So you could take two people, put them through the same experience. One person will develop trauma responses and the other might not, depending on their genetics, their temperament, their level of social support, innate ability to cope with stress. There's all sorts of different reasons why. Previous trauma, a history of previous trauma obviously is going to be more difficult on one person than the other. So yeah, so it's really subjective, which means that it's different for everybody. But also there's just a misunderstanding, I think, that I try to address, that trauma isn't necessarily all these big, huge things like being separated from your birth parents or being in a car accident. Yes, those are traumas, but there's other traumas like emotional neglect, which isn't going to have your children removed from you, but is just as dangerous and just as damaging to somebody's psyche. And so emotional neglect could be things like, invalidating a child all the time, consistently, telling them negative things about themselves, constantly criticizing them, not trusting them. There's all these emotional, relational things that happen, or maybe just being checked out all the time, not connecting with your child. So maybe you're going through something and you're not present consistently with your child. These smaller things can be trauma, and oftentimes caregivers or parents don't recognize those everyday things as traumatizing.
Yeah, people think the big T trauma, but there's little T trauma. And especially if it happens over a longer period of time, right?
Yes.
Like the neglect or the just not being present, not being affirming of your child. If that lasts for a long time, that can be really harmful.
Right.
Yeah, I think our culture is not quite on board with that yet, but it's getting there. I'm reading the Myth of Normal by Gabor Mate. Have you read that yet? Or are you familiar?
I'm reading it right now too.
So good.
Reading it right now too.
The Myth of Normal. Oh my gosh, you guys, go read that book.
Really good.
So good.
Yeah.
It really helps you understand our toxic culture. And I have to get to a more hopeful part. I'm sort of in a, this is what's wrong with our culture part, but hopefully he gives us some answers later on in the book.
Yeah, well, the fact that we're addressing these things now, finally, there's been generations and generations of just been sweeping this all under the rug. And trauma isn't new. This isn't something new that's developed. It's been going on, and it's probably worse for previous generations. But I think a lot of them just froze or didn't address it, didn't process it, didn't have the means to or the ability to. And now we're becoming awakened to what we've all endured and what our family has. And so another book I suggest is It Didn't Start With You by Mark Woolen.
I've heard of that book. I haven't read that yet.
And that will really help you.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. It'll blow your mind. Literally blow your mind.
I'll put those books in the show notes for everybody. Good.
Yeah, that one really helps you understand the intergenerational trauma and how it gets passed down within our bodies and behaviors. So yeah, there's a lot of waking up that we all need to do. And the hopeful thing is there is new research out on what mitigates trauma. So what remediates, what helps to mitigate trauma? And you can go to pacesconnection.com to look at their latest research. And it shows you scientifically that based off of the amount of early life adversity that you may have had, they've developed certain factors that reduce or mitigate the impact of trauma. And primarily, they all have to do with connection.
I was going to say
the relationship that you have.
That connection word is going to be my guess. I didn't know what the answer was, but connection seems to be the answer to a lot of things. So what does that look like? Say you're an adoptive parent and you have a 7-year-old that's got RAD, reactive attachment disorder, and it's just destroying stuff and wreaking havoc. What is an adoptive parent supposed to do?
So the first place I start with every family is increasing the child's sense of safety and trust. That's the foundation, because the trauma is the event, right? Like the traumatic experience is the event, but the trauma that actually takes place in our bodies is the loss of trust and safety in the world around you initially, and other people. But then within yourself, begin to not trust yourself.
Okay.
And so we're constantly asking ourselves, am I okay? And is the world okay? And if you answer no to either of those questions, you're going to see dysregulation within your nervous system and those trauma responses. I mean, if you learn at a very early age that the world is not okay and you're not okay, you can imagine how that sort of multiplies out if there's no intervention. So what we have to do is help children feel safe in the world around them and feel safe within their bodies.
When they're throwing things at you, what are we supposed to do? Because it can get pretty violent, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm sure you've seen some of this behavior. Yeah.
Yes.
But how do we keep ourselves safe and keep our kids safe and help them feel safe when they're lashing out?
Well, at that point, if they're already at that point where they're throwing and hurting themselves or others, that means they are currently not able to connect with the logical, rational part of their brain. And so using words or trying to reason or rationalize with a child who's that escalated will not work. So you can take away the need to talk or speak if you see a child behaving that way. And really what we're trying to do is stay calm within ourselves, as calm as possible, and ask for support, ask for help. I recommend that adoptive parents and foster parents, if you have children who are really acting out in that way, to keep pillows in every room of your house so that you can quickly grab one if you need to protect yourself or the child from any objects. I always encourage families to have an emergency person that you can call instead of, well, I don't want to say instead of. If it's an emergency situation, you always want to call the police, obviously, or 911 or emergency services. So don't get me wrong there. But it's good to have like someone in between there. It's not an emergency, but I need help. And I can't take this anymore. I'm going to do something I regret, or I'm going to say something I regret. Who can I reach out to come be a calming presence for me? Someone who's not so emotionally invested in the relationship, whether that's a neighbor close by or a sister-in-law or an aunt or your mom or somebody who's not so emotionally tied to the child that can bring down the temperature in the room. So those are some suggestions for once things are escalated. But a lot of times, especially with younger kids, you just need to ride it out. There's an arc to a meltdown or a tantrum or a big explosive outburst like that. And there's an arc. So it's building, right? And when you see it building is when you want to intervene.
Okay.
Once you get to the top of the mountain or the top of the arc, it's too late, right? And what you need to do is wait for it to come back down.
Let them get tired.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because the hormones that are being released in their body are reabsorbed typically within about 20 to 30 minutes.
Okay.
And so that's why panic attacks and other nervous system reactions typically last 20 to 30 minutes before it just starts to dissipate. And sometimes just knowing that and knowing that you can wait it out can be helpful.
Knowing that it will not last forever. It will calm down. It always does. And just to address the calling the police piece, it's good to have people that don't come with guns in a situation like that, if you can.
Yes.
I mean, that's kind of your last resort, right?
Yeah.
I always like to tell people about 988. If you have mental health crisis, 988, they're very well-trained responders that can help you on the phone. And I think they can send people out too that might not be carrying guns with them. So
yes,
it's very dangerous when you add guns to these situations because they look very volatile and so terrible things can happen. So, but yeah, I love your idea of having kind of a few layers of backup people that can help when needed and that understand. And can you talk about the co-regulation piece of it, of the caretaker staying calm? Oh my God, how hard is that? Then how important is that?
It is sometimes impossible. So don't blame yourself. It is natural for you to have an aggravated response. You know, it's normal for you to be activated in your nervous system by what the child is doing. So it's kind of our nervous systems link up and we're all connected to each other. And so the closer you are to someone, the more in tune your nervous system is going to be with them. And so you can set your child off by being all worked up, and in turn, they can set you off by being all turned up. You know, we're always sensing our levels of safety based off the people around us because that's the way we evolved. We needed our community. We needed our tribes to survive at one point. So we needed to know how everybody was feeling. Am I in danger? Is there a threat here? Do I need to repair the relationship? So our brains are developed to sense these things and to also pick up on each other's vibes, so to speak. And so that's why when we have dysregulated parents, and dysregulation is just a big word for when you're upset, when you can't manage your emotions. And co-regulation means that you are able to manage your emotions and be in a place of homeostasis, and you bring that to the child's nervous system. And because the child's nervous system is not as sophisticated as yours yet, it's still being built, they link in to your regulated system and they need to learn from you. It's like a loop that's always happening between the two of you. And so children are not born with fully functioning ability to manage their emotions. As if you've spent any time around a 3-year-old, you will know. They need to develop it, and they can only develop it in relation to us. And so if you are calm, you end up bringing that to them. But the first step is getting yourself calm. Right.
Yes.
When things are really rough. So things you can do for that. I mean, there's no quick fix. There's short interventions you can do, but you want more than just this. But I'll give you guys a few, like stepping in the bathroom and splashing cold water on your face can quickly shift your perspective into like, okay, I need to calm down. I need to get myself into a better place. Or you might do some deep breathing if that works for you. I know it doesn't work for everyone, but you know, stepping away, taking a couple of deep breaths, even getting fresh air, stepping outside onto the porch or into the driveway for a minute and getting some fresh air and the sun on your skin. Like you want something kind of disrupt the pattern that you're in. Like you're in that angry place or frustrated or scared place, and you kind of need to interrupt that with something soothing to indicate to your body that you're safe, because you don't feel safe. So you need things that are going to help you feel safe, whether that's petting an animal who's really soft and loving.
Ooh,
animals can be incredibly healing and helpful for anxiety for children and adults.
They're good co-regulators.
Yes, because they're always much calmer typically than we are.
We have 3 big dogs, but one of them, if our voices start getting raised or we start getting like anxious, it comes right around and nudges us with its nose like, calm down, calm down. It knows like, They're therapy dogs and they're not even trained to do that. They're very intuitive and connected more than humans most of the time, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So be like your dog.
They are amazing. Well, yeah, and animals are stepping stones. So you talk about children with reactive attachment. And so animals can be a stepping stone to building attachment. So maybe they don't feel safe with humans yet because of what they've been through. And they are pushing you away and they're pushing everyone away with their behavior out of a need for safety. They're not doing that because they don't like you or hate you, but because it feels safer to be separated from you. And in fact, when children do start to trust and feel safe, you will see an increase sometimes in the challenging behavior because they may have been holding it in a lot. And when they start to feel safe is when they start to release the valid rage that they have.
Tell us more about that, because I think adoptive moms particularly get the brunt of it.
Yes.
The brunt of the anger toward their birth mother goes on to the adoptive mother. And also it typically means that you're the safe one, that they've been holding it in at school all day or at their baseball practice or whatever. They've been holding it in, they come home and then whammo, the adoptive mom gets it, or the foster mom or whoever.
Yes. Or grandmom. Yeah.
Are we supposed to feel honored?
Oh, trust me. My daughter is not adopted and she does the same thing. I think it's very natural.
Okay. Oh, it's just a mom thing.
Yeah, I think it's just a mom thing. It's one of the wonderful prizes we get.
Yeah.
But, I see my daughter do that. She's not in foster care. She's not adopted, but she holds herself together all day at school, puts on a happy face. And because she feels that she has to there, she doesn't feel the ability to really be herself 100% because there's rules to follow. There's other people watching. There's opinion, all the things. And then she comes home and a lot of times wants to pick a fight and wants to, push back and disobey and not listen to me and all of those things. And I think we don't often realize our expectations for children are so high.
Yes.
And we don't often realize how difficult and how stressful their little worlds are. Because to us, we're like, oh, it'd be fun to be in kindergarten again.
Yeah.
Like, to play all day and you get to be outside and you don't have to sit at a desk and do work and blah, blah. But for them, they're so young that everything to them is stimulating.
Everything's new.
Every new thing, every new person that comes in, every new sound they hear startles them. And every new, everything, they're still developing like, am I safe?
Yeah.
Is the world safe? They're still trying to decide that.
Yeah. And if you've got any sort of abandonment issue at all, if you've had any experience with abandonment, nothing's safe.
Right.
Nothing in your world is safe until, I don't know when. When does that change? I don't know. Until you decide to trust things are safe. But that takes a long time.
Right.
So imagine just going through your world, just not trusting anything.
Yeah.
That'd be exhausting. So we adoptive parents and foster parents should not feel personally affronted, or that it's not that they don't like us or that we're not good parents or that we're not likable. It's more that they think that we're the safest person to let loose on.
Yes. So they have valid rage, right? If you've been abandoned or you've lost your family to death or whatever it might be, you're holding on to a lot of fear and rage within your body and your mind and your heart. And it needs to come out. You need a release and an expression of that. And unfortunately, it tends to happen with moms and dads because that's who the child does feel safest with. And while I know that's no consolation, like you said, it does help shift your perspective from being resentful, which I totally get. Yeah. Sometimes I feel that too. Yep. I do. I'm like, oh, can you just, but it can help give you patience, perspective, and empathy in moments when you might want to lose it on your child for their behavior.
Yeah, it's not personal. And just try to put ourselves in their shoes a bit. It's tough. It's really tough. Tough for everybody. Can you touch on the sense of grief and loss for the adoptive or foster parents and also the birth parents? I mean, all of us in this system are suffering from grief and loss. The adoptees first, of course, the most, and they had no choice in the matter. So I always say they have priority and they are the ones that have the most. But can you address the grief and loss on the other two sides of the triad?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, it's unusual for people to acknowledge the loss that happens. But if you're adopting, there's usually oftentimes a reason, maybe why you're adopting. Not always. Maybe you could have your own biological children, but if you weren't able to, there's that sense of loss. There's also, because adoption is so idealized in the movies and in our culture, there's sort of the loss of your expectations, your dreams being dashed sometimes when you realize that it's much different than how you expected it to be.
Yes.
So that's a loss that you often don't get to even talk to anyone about because you're afraid of how they might judge you or criticize you for having those feelings.
Yeah, you sound really ungrateful or like,
Yeah.
whoa.
Yeah.
But it's really, for an adoptive parent to have a child that's so struggling and you have no idea what to do, it's not what you had in mind, you know?
Yeah.
When you imagined how this would go, this is not it. And that can be really, really tough.
Yeah.
And so we're dealing with loss. Our children are dealing with loss. And for the adoptive parents too, there's a loss of, we don't have anyone that looks like us. Kind of the opposite. The child doesn't have anyone to mirror either, but we don't have anyone that is carrying on our lineage. Well, some adoptive parents have birth children too, but our adopted child does not. There's that disconnect too.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Again, much greater on the other side of things for the adoptee, but I think those losses are important to consider.
Yeah.
And then what about for the birth parent?
Absolutely. So the birth parent, obviously, regardless of our opinion of them based on their behavior, likely they're suffering from trauma as well. If you are unable to care for your child, the likelihood of you having either a mental health issue or addiction caused by trauma or your own significant loss is almost expected. Or I can't really think of a scenario where a mother would abandon her child without some sort of severe life experiences and mental health issues. So they are coping with the loss of their child. I mean, even if you don't see that remorse, it's in there somewhere.
Yeah.
And oftentimes they're grieving and feeling shameful for their choices and decisions. And they're all alone. I mean, can you imagine being stripped of your motherhood? I can't. I mean, imagine someone telling you you're not good enough to raise your own blood, your flesh and blood.
I think our culture does not give birth parents nearly enough support. And they're just supposed to sit there and forget about everything and just move on. It's like, oh my God. And then I see a lot of adoptive parents in the groups that I'm on Facebook and stuff. They didn't show up again, or they screwed this up, or they're so bad, da, 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 da. There's a lot of birth family shaming going on by adoptive families. And I think if we just put ourselves in their shoes just for a moment and go, well, I probably wouldn't want to meet with the people who are caring for my baby that I couldn't keep either. That might be really, really conflicting and difficult. And I might procrastinate or be flaky too, you know, and how can we as adoptive parents kind of hold that too and help support them in that and make it as easy as possible for them to stay connected. I think it's got to be really tough. We're not in connection with Joy's birth family because it was a closed adoption from Japan, but it's a really tough situation for all involved. So
yeah, I mean, one perspective, just to give you an idea, is so trauma. So let's say the reason that they had to give up their child or the reason they were removed from their parents was because stemming from trauma that the parents had, right? And then that trauma, like I said earlier, strips not only your sense of safety in the world, but the sense of trust and safety in yourself.
Oh, yeah.
So there are a lot of moms and parents who don't trust themselves to be in close connection with their child. They are feeling as though they might screw up again, that they've already screwed up. I better just they're better off at a distance from me. Some parents, I think, feel not in a hateful, mean way, but in a protective way. They don't trust themselves and they think this child is better off without me. They truly believe that they are no good.
Well, and our culture tells them that all the time.
Yeah.
How many people from the 60s, those birth mothers in the baby scoop era said, your baby would be much better off with these other people.
Yeah.
I mean, they were literally told that. And our culture constantly gives them that feedback. So of course they would avoid or keep themselves from getting close and find ways to not connect. So that's really tough. But if we can just remember that all of us are traumatized. All of us are trying our best to do the best we can with what cards we were given and have some empathy for each other. Real briefly, can you talk about adolescence, and especially for adoptive and foster kids? That adolescence seems to be when a lot of people kind of, it's a breaking point for a lot of people. That's when my son kind of fell apart. It was right around 13 or so. Why is that? And what can we do when they're starting to reach that age?
Yeah. So, obviously we know that's a pivotal time in a child's life because hormonally things are shifting. Puberty is taking place. Their world has sort of opened up. It's no longer so focused on the relationship between you as the adult and the child, but they are now having more access to friends and influences in that way, more access to, like you said, opportunities to get involved with substances and discovering that can bring relief.
Mhm.
And as adults, if you look at what adults do, they do the same thing.
Oh, yeah.
Little kids, they don't have that choice, right? Because we're controlling everything and they don't know about it really
Yeah.
most of the time. And so they don't know there's this substance out there that could magically take away all this pain.
Oh, yeah.
And so they're living with it that whole time. And then finally they come across something and they're like, whoa, this is a game changer, right?
Yep.
And it's soothing for them to have an escape, to finally be able to hit the escape button. So I think those are a couple of reasons why. And of course, there's other changes. There's more expectations on teens and adolescents. And we overestimate their abilities a lot of times. We overestimate their maturity, especially a child in foster or kinship or adoptive families. They are likely not operating at their developmental level age wise. Like they are probably having some developmental delays. So if your son's 19, he might actually be 16 emotionally or mentally. And that's not an insult to him in any way, but just because of the damage that takes place from the early life trauma, that your brain just can't adapt as quickly.
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
It's tough because they look kind of grown up. They're big and tall, and they look like they should be able to handle jobs or whatever, school or whatever. But man, their brain's not done cooking till 25, right?
Yeah, some later.
It's a long ways to go.
And like I said, if like your son, there's usually a delay in functioning and development given what he's experienced and been through. So, and then if you add drug use onto that too, that's inhibiting different functions of the brain.
Yeah. I've heard that whatever age you start using drugs is kind of where you emotionally stay.
Interesting.
Because he didn't go to the dances, and he didn't have a regular dating life, and he didn't, do the regular things because he was in the drug culture and just sort of treading water for all of those years since he's been using drugs. So he's just lacking some life experiences. So people look at him and like, well, why can't he just go get a job? I'm like, well, yeah, it's a lot of catching up to do.
Yeah.
And oh God, the drugs, you guys, there's drugs everywhere. I have a friend that teaches 5th grade. There's drugs at her elementary school. I'm in California, so the vaping's everywhere, but I understand that it's even where it's not legal for grownups to do it. I think it's just so easy for kids to get a hold of drugs. So
yeah, I know.
Adults need to wake up about that a bit. I was completely naive about it, and I didn't understand it, how prevalent it was. Do you run across that a lot in your work?
Oh, yeah.
Drugs?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Like we both said, it's hitting the escape button from the pain.
Sure.
And when you're young like that, the other piece of this is that, you and I have fully developed brains that understand what this will do to us and understand the long-term consequences of that. And we've had time to come up with other coping skills, or maybe we've had support within our lives that have taught us how to cope in different ways. But young people, they are not really thinking about the long-term consequences. They're living right now in the here and now. And so the future feels very far away to them. And they feel like they have plenty of time to fix things and change the course. Life, it feels like your oyster at that age. You don't think anything is going to stop you a lot of times. And you don't have the impulse control at that age.
Right. And that risk taker behavior, some kids are just a little bit more risky than others and just like, what the hell?
Right.
So my kid tried his first vape pen in science class, just so
oh, geez.
everybody understands what's going on in our schools right now. It's crazy.
Yeah.
And I know that you do a lot of work with kinship families. Where did that interest come from? And Can you explain what kinship families are for those that don't know?
Sure. I became interested in working with those families during my time when I was in home doing family crisis work, because about half of my caseload was kinship families, or grand families is another nice word that I like to use.
I like that.
And so a kinship family is any person who had a previous relationship with a child, takes them in to raise them either temporarily or permanently because their parents are unable to. So it could be a grandparent raising a grandchild. It could be an aunt or uncle raising a niece or nephew. It could be a neighbor or a coach or a teacher. Those are considered, they're considered fictive kin. So they're not blood related, but because there's already an established relationship, they're not just going into a complete unknown person's home to live with. So they consider that a kinship or a grand family.
Nice.
And so when I was working with those families, they're really unique from foster and adoptive families, and they are very unsupported and lack a lot of access to resources. And I didn't have a children's book to talk to the kids and the grandparents about what was going on. And I said to myself, one day I'm going to write a book about this. The children, so they have something they can see themselves reflected in and not feel so isolated. Because that's another big issue, is that the grandparents are isolated from the, typical, in quotes, other parents because they're older, right? So they don't normally fit in with the average aged parent. And so they're isolated in their role as a caregiver. And then the child feels isolated because they don't see anybody else necessarily being raised by their grandparents. So it's like they may get teased, like, oh, why are your parents so old? Or, they just, kids, can be cruel. So I really wanted to have a book that explained to them their situation and gave them some coping skills to address the big feelings they were having and to normalize what they're going through so that they don't feel so different, and they can kind of say, oh, you know what? There are other people like me. There's even a book about it, and then there's something powerful about a book being out there about your situation that helps to ground you and make you feel a little less stigmatized. Yeah.
So great. Yeah. So your book is called A Grand Family for Sullivan.
Yes.
And they're koalas, right?
Yes, they're koalas. I love koalas.
Who doesn't like koalas? They're so cute. That's so great. And I have had a grand family on the pod, and I didn't realize, like, foster families get all sorts of funds. Adoptive families, not as much, but they get all sorts of training and all sorts of things from maybe the agency they worked with. Grand families get like nothing.
They get very, very little to nothing. The way it works, at least where I live, let's say a child needs to be removed from a dangerous situation in the middle of the night. The first thing they do is look for next of kin. And if they find a next of kin willing to take them in, child welfare says, see ya.
See ya. Wouldn't want to be ya. And
toodaloo.
Got that cleaned up and done.
Yep. And unless you fight for it, unless you really go after it. And then even then, there's very little government funding for these types of situations. It's growing. And I've been on some of the frontline discussions and advocacy work for grand families to help them receive access to more resources and support. And it is growing, and there are changes that are slowly happening, but it's nowhere near the level of support that foster and adoptive families have. And I'm sure you guys don't get much either, but it's like almost nothing compared to that. So
yeah, at least we have somewhere to go looking, but that's really tough. Well, that's a great way for you to serve that community, to be on this systemic level and working to fix things upstream. And you work with courts and hospitals, and tell me a little bit about what you do and who you work with.
Yeah. So one of my biggest projects right now is training the child welfare professionals in different states across the country on trauma-informed and trauma-responsive care, and also on why our connections matter. So, why it's so important to stay connected to birth family when possible, why it's important to stay connected to those people from your community, like those coaches or neighbors, how that affects your self-identity, your self-worth, your ability to turn to people when, maybe nobody's left by your side. Having a support network is the greatest indicator of future success. And without our connections, we really will fall off the edge of that cliff pretty fast. So I am an advocate for helping children who are aging out of foster care find and get reconnected to either fictive kin, which are, like I said, neighbors, coaches, previous friends, or extended family members. So maybe this child came into the system and there's family out there that never knew they were in the system. Never knew.
Wow.
Because the way they contact you is very unproductive a lot of times. You know, they're required by law to send a letter that says, you may or may not know a child that's about to enter foster care. Are you interested in learning more? And then a lot of times people are like, well, they must have the wrong address. Or so there's lots of family out there. Everybody has a family. Everybody has somebody out there. And so whether it's your immediate parent or birth parent, it could be an uncle, an aunt, a second cousin who wants to be supportive. And so we're trying to foster those relationships and help kids who are aging out with nobody get connected to somebody.
Yeah. That's amazing.
Yeah.
And what organization is that?
Oh, thank you for asking. So that's a free tech platform that's available for anybody to use called connectourkids.org. And so child welfare professionals, foster agencies, CASA volunteers, you can go to that website and start looking around. They have the most innovative technology on family search and family finding and family engagement.
Nice. And did you want to talk about Connections Matter Academy real quick before we close up?
Yeah, thanks. I know I've got all these different projects I'm working on. It's been a very busy year. So the Connections Matter Academy is an animated series on YouTube that was created by me and 30 other children with a history of being in foster care.
Okay.
So there was 30 of them, and me and a couple of other trauma therapists who created this animated series to help them understand trauma, primarily children who are aging out of the system, help them understand the trauma they've experienced, give them some coping skills, and teach them about healthy relationships and how to get support and how to build relationships with others, but really to understand their brains and their body and their nervous system and how what they've been through and what's happened to them has affected their mind and body and delivered to them the place that they are now, delivered them in the place they are now, so that it's not their fault. And we have a video called It's Not Your Fault.
Yes.
And we really want them to understand that what they're going through is a product of what's happened to them.
Yeah. I learn a lot from your videos. I know they're meant for what age group, like teens?
Yeah, we aimed them for adolescents and teens, even young adults up to late 20s. But some videos are appropriate for even younger kids who might be going through some of this stuff. I always encourage people to watch them first. As the adult, to watch them first, because you never know what questions they might bring up, and just to make sure they're appropriate for the age of your child. But yeah, some of them are great for even younger kids, like preteens. And I find them helpful for myself, for adults.
Oh, yeah. It's really great information, and just in little nuggets. It's only a couple of minutes long. And just little nuggets of trauma education.
Right.
I think they're really, really great.
Yeah.
Well, since we talked about grief and loss today, I think what I'll do is I'll play the Loss and Grief episode. I'll just play it right here. And then we'll put the link so you can watch the video if you want to see the video when you're not driving your car or walking your dog. So here's 2 minutes of just the audio part of the video dealing with loss and grief from connectourkids.org. Take a listen and go check out their actual video through the link I'm going to put in the notes.
Today's episode is centered around a topic that can be particularly difficult to discuss: loss. Life can feel much harder for people who have suffered significant loss early in life. And that loss might take on many forms. For example, death, family separation, loss of a home, a breakup with a partner, the end of a friendship, or even the loss of a treasured item. Whatever type of loss you're grieving, remember that you're not alone. And if you're feeling overwhelmed by grief, it's okay to ask for help. Grief is natural, and there's nothing wrong with longing for someone who's no longer available to you. It can be helpful to know that grief ebbs and flows over time, like the tides of the ocean. Some days will be better than others, but over time, the intense pain that you're feeling now will eventually subside. Regardless of the type of loss you're experiencing, here are some practices that can help you cope Number one, don't gloss over your loss. It's okay to feel your feelings and acknowledge your pain. That might mean feeling sad, angry, or distraught. Secondly, be patient and open-minded with yourself. Allow yourself to grieve in your own way and in your own time frame. You can also share your feelings with a trusted teacher, school counselor, or coach. Remember when we talked about strategic sharing? This is a great way to put that tool to use. You can also ask a counselor if there's a support group at your school or in your community. This allows you to connect with others in your situation and share with them in a safe space. Find ways to connect with those around you whom you trust, because human connection can help bring healing. And finally, you can create a ritual to honor the person or thing that you're grieving. Understand that if someone you love has passed away, your relationship doesn't have to end. The relationship you have with them just changes from a physical connection to a spiritual connection. They're not gone at all. They just exist in your life in a different way now.
If people want to get in touch with you, I know you're not doing private psychotherapy or one-on-one clients anymore, but if people want to get in touch with you to train their group of therapists or to work with their CASA group or whatever, how would they get in touch with you?
So you can find me on my website, which is BethTyson.com. And I'm sure you can put a link to that for anyone who's interested in the notes. And I'm also on Facebook quite a bit as Beth Tyson Trauma Consulting, as well as I offer a free private Facebook group that has almost 5,000 members now of people who want to know more about trauma. And a lot of them are mental health professionals. It's a great place to go and ask questions and have all these professional mental health experts like get back to you. So it's really cool whenever someone asks a question in there, like to see like all the love and support. And I make sure that the requirements to enter into my group are really safe, and everybody has to provide an email address and they have to answer my questions. And if I get anything that looks weird, I don't allow them into the group. Yeah. So
is that your Emotominds group?
Yes, Emotominds.
Nice. Yeah, that's a really good group. And you have a lot of really great content on your Facebook too. I really enjoy it. Just little memes and little things that just kind of keep you going. It's like, okay, here's a little gem for you to think about today. Yeah. It's really, really
so
great.
A lot of my work is about, yes, there is trauma. Yes, these are hard things, but we need to find the hope. Or else, what are we here for? You know, we have to find the hope, and we have to find what does work and how we can move forward. And so I try to share information that will help people do that. And so that's kind of the goal is not just to talk about trauma and how awful it all can be, but to give people strategies and skills and perspectives that can begin the healing process, even though it's a lifelong journey.
I really see you in that space doing that very strongly. So I really appreciate it as an adoptive parent. I appreciate all the work you're doing, and I can see the bigger picture work that you're doing,
Thank you.
Which is so, so needed. So thank you, Beth, for being on. I'm grateful you took the time to be on our show. I know you're going to help a lot of people, all sorts of people that listen, adoptees, adoptive parents, people that don't have anything to do with adoption. And I hope they go look you up, look up your videos and all your services that you provide. So thank you for being on.
Yeah, thank you for having me today. It was a pleasure.
Yeah. And again, I'll put all those links in the notes, and go find Unraveling Adoption on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. And if you'd like to support our show to make sure we stay a commercial-free podcast, you can support us by going to patreon.com/unravelingadoption. You can contribute a small amount each month and help us just keep afloat with all of the expenses that it takes to keep this podcast going. Also, if you're an adoptive parent or foster parent or kinship parent, I have a group called Aptitude that is for parents that want to face these challenges in adoption and foster care. And I invite you to come join Aptitude. It's free. I'll put the link below as well. So I think that's it. Thank you all for listening. Please share this episode with anyone you think that might be helped by it. And Beth and I want you to
stay safe.